Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the New Books in Islamic Studies podcast. But as a guest, Shanaz, how are you doing?
I'm great, Shobhana. Thank you so much for inviting me. How are you doing?
I'm great. I just love that I get to flip the table on you. You get to be the guest for a change. This will be so fun, and I know our listeners will love it. And I know our listeners know who you are, but I think it would be fun to like frame yourself in the context of this book that you've just written, amazing book, titled Feminism, Tradition and Change in Contemporary Islam, Negotiating Islamic Law and Gender. So, can you tell us a little bit about who you are for anyone who may not know you, which seems wild to me that people don't know you? Yeah, and we'll go from there.
I've been preparing for this question since I started being a host on this podcast. Like, how would I answer this question of who am I? I am Shehnaz Haqqani, currently an assistant professor of religion at Mercer University. I do all things Islam and gender. I'm crazy about all things Islam and gender. And is that it, or do I also tell my intellectual journey? I forget.
Yeah, I mean, I usually like to know your a little bit of your intellectual journey and really like what led to writing this book. I mean, it makes sense for someone who considers myself a friend of yours, why you wrote this book, but maybe for other people, they won't know. So why put this particular book and what intellectual journey led you to the book?
Yes, of course. So when I was getting my, like any good Pakistani South Asian Muslim girl, I was supposed to be a medical doctor when I grew up, and that was a plan since I was born. And then I entered my undergraduate school and took a humanities course that I just wanted to get rid of, like, just to get these points, just to get the credit because I wanted to just go do all my bio stuff instead. And that course turned out to be the reason that I'm in Islamic studies now. It was with Devon Stewart at Emory University. I think it was an introduction to the Middle East or Middle Eastern studies or something like that. And Devon Stewart, who is a scholar of Islam and Islamic law and all things Islam, and he would go off on these wonderfully fascinating tangents about how religions develop and evolve, and an occasional anecdote from Islamic texts here and there, hilarious stuff. And I was a very good Muslim, practicing Muslim girl, which in that context to me meant being very conservative for the most part, believing that there was only one Islam, there was no such thing as multiple kinds of Islam, and everybody practiced Islam the same way. And if they didn't, they were wrong. So I would push back against him a lot. I would constantly correct him, and he was incredibly patient with me. I've written to him since, apologizing multiple times that, oh my God, I'm so sorry that I was like that. But where he's still a mentor to me. He's really the main reason that I entered Islamic studies. So I would spend hours with him in office hours talking about, like, but that can't be right, or wait, this means this, then that means this, and I was making these connections, and in some ways, it was so frustrating because why did I not know that feminism could be as much of feminism could have as much of a room in Islamic tradition in Islam as the patriarchy, as the sexist practices of Islam did. And it wasn't at that time specifically that I was figuring this out, but it was the beginning of my journey. And it was deeply liberating as well. For a moment, it was a crisis. I went through a spiritual crisis, no longer knowing exactly what. So Islam took a while to develop. That means that it's not exactly from God like I thought it was. The Quran is open to interpretation, which means that so much of the stuff that I've grown up with may be false. It was really disturbing for me. So I went through a crisis for several years. I eventually decided to go ahead and dedicate my life to these questions, the kind of passion and the love that I learned that I had for these conversations and these things that I was learning that were also affecting my personal life, then my religion, my way of living. I haven't been able to look back since. And I disappointed my parents very much because I ended up with a PhD in Islamic studies, which I remember at times when I would be would be struggling with the academic world. The one reason I never quit Shobana was because I didn't know how I would tell my parents how I would tell my parents that I quit my PhD program, only for them to say to me, like any good South Asian parents, when they're trying to, convince or what's the word, motivate their kids, they insult you, or they certainly insulted me. And so they'd be like, you can't even get a PhD in your own religion. And that thought just kept, like, I couldn't face that. And so I survived the whole PhD program. It was painful at times. And that's how I ended up with a PhD in Islamic studies from UT Austin. Um, but really trying to figure out the kind of room, the kind of room that Islam that exists within Islam for the nuance that everybody acknowledges exists, right? We hear a lot that Islam is the Islamic tradition is diverse, it's nuanced, but then you ask, great, can women marry non-Muslims? And they're like, oh, no, not there. Can women lead mixed gender prayers? No, not that way. It's not that nuanced. It's not that diverse. And so I wanted to really understand the process of the change that happens within the Islamic tradition and with religions generally, and the kind of language that we're using to explain the process of this change.
I relate so much to the shame that follows all of us. South Asian women everywhere we go. But I'm glad to hear that somehow you work through it, and then there's some channeling of it productively to a new chosen family and intellectual community that you've established yourself within, that we're so grateful that you do what you do. And a lot of what you said also makes sense in terms of some of the methods of this book. So you do amazing work in terms of, you have the command of the textual, the historical, and then you bring in this qualitative ethnographic element of these participants that you interviewed. So it's really also kind of covers this kind of American Islam also framework in terms of how are Muslims, particularly in Austin, understanding or approaching some of this. So can you tell us how this kind of methodological approach arrived for you? What were some of the challenges of that? I can't imagine it being easy, especially in your introduction. You talk about people who are threatening to you sometimes, either intellectually in terms of Islamic law, or actually threatening to your humanity as a Muslim woman.
Absolutely. Oh my God, it was a very difficult process. Figuring out who to interview, sending out emails, getting the local mosques involved. They were very supportive. And then when people would find out that I didn't cover my hair, for example, the pushback against that, or oh, so you're not afraid of God? And then figuring out within the moment, am I a scholar here? Am I a researcher here? Am I a person with feelings here? Like, what do I do with my identity? So the different kinds of crises all were just right there. Yeah, for the project, in order for me to answer the larger question of how do Muslims negotiate change? How do they explain in very, very simple terms, how do they explain what gets to change with time? What is Islamic? We cannot touch that. I needed to be able to know what the sacred sources said, what the Quran said, what the Hadith said, what the interpretations of those sources said, what Islamic legal texts have had to say on some of these issues. All of these issues are essentially illegal within the Islamic legal tradition as well. So I had to look at a lot of those different sources in order to then be able to figure out what are regular Muslims thinking about those issues, right? So sort of a comparison of, hey person, what do you think Islam has to say on this issue? And what do you wish it would say? What do you want? What do you think, right? And sometimes there were serious discrepancies and they were aware of that. And they were like, yeah, I disagree with what Islam historically said or Islamic law historically said. And so it wouldn't have been possible for me to evaluate or to assess the change that has occurred, to measure the change that has occurred, if I wasn't looking at both the contemporary people's perspectives, the qualitative part of the study, and then also the textual component, where I'm looking at what the texts are actually saying. And in some cases, they would often say, I don't know, what does Islam say on that? Here's what I think, but what does Islam say? And sometimes they would be, I've noticed this thing where, and I've commented on this in many, many, many spaces, that too often a lot of Muslims, and I was one of them, believe that if something isn't sexist, then it's not Islamic. If something is too feminist, it's probably not Islamic because it's Western feminist and it's being forced on Islam, etc. So if it doesn't feel familiar, it's not Islamic. And so sometimes people would want to say something that sounded feminist, but they'd be like, I have a feeling this isn't what Islam says, right? Which was so revelatory about what we're thinking of Islam. And so for me, both of the sources were essential. I also have to add, though, that I remember when I was and I've been very blessed with getting a lot of wonderful mentorship in Islamic studies from people that that I've read, that I know, that I've been following for over a decade now. Several people told me that in order to be respected as a scholar of Islam, you have to know the sources. And by sources, they meant you need to know the classical Islamic tradition, the basically pre-modern Islamic tradition, and know the texts very well. I love all of that. I love the texts. I love working with the texts, as sometimes as frustrating as they sometimes get. But I also love the contemporary period. I'm implicated in all of the changes, in all of the things that we're saying about Islam. And so I really wanted to understand that as well. So essentially, initially, my primary motivation for including the earlier sources were because I wanted to make sure that people knew I know my stuff. And then once I had that, then I could, as a lot of my mentors would tell me, once you've got the sacred sources down, then you can be taken seriously as an authority, and you can then do whatever you want with your second book. And so that was, but both sources were. It turns out that both were really necessary. I couldn't look at what are the changes, how has Islam changed in the past 1400 years if I wasn't looking at the original sources, the earlier sources, and then also contemporary ones.
And I think that's one of the great contributions of the book. I think the way that you're mapping kind of the historical context and how people are employing or deploying notions of consensus or Islamic law versus what is Islam. And really, I think leads towards your conclusion, which we'll get to, is like the politics around what are urgent matters and what are relevant matters and how complicated that is. And until you kind of walk us through all of it, we can't really arrive at that conclusion with you. So I think it was really productive and generative. And of course, I imagine because Islamic feminism is as fraught as it is, there's a legibility reality, and then to have kind of a command of these texts is actually politically necessary, which is both obviously messed up, but is kind of the reality of, I think, the subfield that you exist in. And so I understand, yeah.
And deeply, for me, rewarding in personal spaces now, having done this study, having worked with several different topics for the book, it's been so liberatory and liberating for me as a Muslim person to shut down any conversations when people are telling me you're wrong or that's not what Islam says, or and now I have the tools, I have the language, I have literal references, right, that I can say, not quite, it's a little bit more complex than that, or that's not what the texts say, actually that's what we would think it's, or what we wanted to say. And so I do encourage people to study the sources when you're talking. That's also a political statement, right? Like, oh, go just study Arabic, right? But I do think it has, for me, it has been so incredibly helpful to have that as a force that is in my favor, that I can say, no, I know what I'm talking about, and you're not right here in this case. So
yeah. And I think the book would be a resource in that way to get people on that path, to say, here are the resources, here are the medieval conversations, be it the Quranic, the surahs or the hadith traditions, or what the medieval scholars are saying. And then I think that's actually quite an amazing toolkit that you've given to people, especially to Muslim women, on some of these matters that are quite complicated. And I would also add that you engage or you survey some contemporary Muslim scholars, especially on YouTube and social media, like Nouman Ali Khan and others. And so those are also pieces that get into this mapping process. So chapter 1 really sets up what I would understand as your conceptual and methodological intervention, and you are introducing this idea of rhizomatic. And so can you kind of walk us through what this is? Because this comes up throughout the book a lot in terms of this is the framework that you are actually reading or interpreting what the people that you've interviewed are saying to you.
Yeah, I thought a lot about how to make sense of the process of change, and I wanted some kind of a term or a model that would explain that the picking and choosing, quote unquote, picking and choosing, which before this study, honestly, I hated this idea. I hated that people were picking and choosing. And even though I now realize I've been doing it all my life and every single one of us is doing it, right? But there seems to be a certain kind of picking and choosing that's allowed. There are certain things you can pick and choose and certain things you can't touch. And I wanted to understand that. So what happened was, I think it was 2016 when I finally settled on my dissertation topic. And I was talking to Kristen Brustad at UT, who is an Arabic professor, now retired. She was a dear mentor of mine, just really, really an amazing support system for me. I was telling her about my project, and I started talking about the Islamic tradition. I love talking about this. I was telling her some of the stuff that I'd learned, that I'd noticed, that I was trying to describe in this book how change works, when change is considered essential, when it's not considered essential. And she said to me, it sounds like you're doing a rhizomatic. You're approaching the Islamic tradition rhizomatically. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And she tells me that there's a lot of scholars who are now looking at using the idea of the rhizome, which is a kind of plant. And I'll get to that in just a second, but that a lot of scholars are approaching their specific fields or subfields using the rhizome as a model to describe something. And so people apparently are looking at the Quranic interpretation, tafsir, exegesis as a rhizomatic process, or Sufism, or Michael Muhammad Knight has done an excellent book on atheism, like how he argues that atheism too can essentially be a part of Islam, and using this rhizomatic approach and so on. And so it got me interested. That was the beginning of, it got me interested because I was like, oh, this is excellent, because if I can just simply describe to someone what a rhizome is, then it might make sense how picking and choosing works and how traditions generally work. The alternative to a right, or it's often contrasted with a tree, with the model of a tree, which has a specific root, a specific starting point, and an end point, and so on. And but a rhizome doesn't have a specific starting point, right? And so we apply it to it. Think of ginger is a very common rhizome, for example. So the idea here is that the diversity that exists in the Islamic tradition, in religious traditions generally, can be described as a rhizome. There's no one fixed interpretation. It's very, very pluralistic. Basically the different think of branches can just sprout at any point in a rhizome, right? So there's no one. In other words, because I was also trying to think about how does feminism become a part of the tradition, right? Because in same year, 2016, I was at a center where I was studying, doing some Islamic studies training, and everybody hated Islamic. My teachers all absolutely were disgusted by Islamic feminism, and they kept on telling me Islamic feminism has no space within the Islamic tradition. And I wanted to push back against that, but I had no tools yet, and I didn't have the language yet, right? And I was a student. And so learning that, wait, the Islamic tradition is so incredibly diverse. Not only do we have plenty of rooms within it, right? Within the Islamic legal system, we've got a whole bunch of terms like takhayyur, right? Which literally means picking and choosing, or like choosing the best parts of the best interpretation of an opinion, the best interpretation or opinion on a particular issue, choosing that over one that is more harmful, or choosing that over one that's not more, preferable. So all of these different tools that exist within the Islamic legal tradition that I'm not making up. I'm not saying, oh, let's invent a new tool and call it takhayyur. Let's invent a new tool and call it this and that. And so all of that I'm describing as, oh, there's plenty of room for the regular person like me, the scholars, the preachers online that I very much disagree with, who have no training in Islamic sciences, but they too get to have space within the Islamic tradition. That all of these people, I think of these as different points, starting points of where the Islamic tradition is constantly being developed, right? Through whom the Islamic tradition is constantly being developed. And one of the most fascinating things about the rhizome, that it doesn't have a starting point. I struggled with this initially because I remember thinking, could somebody argue, and very validly, that, well, the Quran is the starting point of the Islamic tradition, right? But it turns out it's not, right? When we talk about female-led prayers, female-led mixed gender prayers, the issue is not in the Quran at all. Nobody's using the Quran to argue against it. Nobody's saying the Quran has nothing to say on prayer leaderships generally. And so we assume, or female inheritance, right? In my study, the female inheritance issue is so fascinating because explicitly the Quranic text seems to be saying daughters get half the inheritance of sons. But yet most of my participants are like, yeah, I know that's what the Quran says, but I disagree with that. And I think God would be totally fine with that because my context is different, right? So here, the Quran is not the starting point. Something else is a starting point. And the starting point, ultimately, I suggest in my book, is our own personal experiences. And the impact that this particular issue, this opinion will have on us. And so the rhizome, I think what it ends up doing is it decentralizes Islam, the Islamic tradition. There's no one starting point anymore. Everything is interconnected. So what I have to say is connect. I don't just make up something. I am still going to I'm still going to make sure that I'm familiar with what the tradition, what the scholars around me are saying, what the preachers are saying. Someone like Yasmin Mugahid, who comes up in my study a lot, that people quoted a lot, right? What she has to say. And then eventually I can form my own opinions. And like a lot of my respondents are like, I don't care what the scholars have to say on this. I completely disagree with them, right? So I think ultimately one of the best ways, or the best, at least at the time that I was writing this study, probably the best way to articulate or describe the process of change that I'm really, really invested in the book.
No, and I think it's really generative and visually so as well, right? Like I think as you've described what it visually does in terms of decentralized authority, text, traditions, communities, individuals. It also, I think, puts things on like a map, but it doesn't say provide the route exactly of which way you have to go, right?
And that's one of the most important sort of qualities of a of the rhizomatic model, right? That it's so organic, right? Like I can't stop the change anymore. I can't stop. I know one person gets to play a role in how the change happens and when the change is necessary enough to happen. And so the organic, it's been applied to, you know, how cities are structured and how city making, how urban development happens, how economics work, how politics work. It's been applied to a whole bunch of other fields and subfields as well. And I just think it's so fascinating. It's an excellent way, I think, to describe the organic evolution and development of traditions as well, and cultures and languages and so on.
Yeah, it's great. So having set all of this up and kind of giving us some context for some of these broader kind of conversations you're entering into, the book is really divided into two sections. So section one is on the negotiables, and section two is on the non-negotiables. So this is really interesting. So the section one has three chapters, and you deal with child marriage, sexual slavery, and female inheritance. So can you tell us a little bit, I mean, it might seem obvious to some people why that these particular case studies are in the negotiables, but can you tell us a little bit about why these case studies or these issues, legal binding cases or whatever?
Absolutely. So when I, you know, in the dissertation, this is a product of my dissertation, right? In the dissertation version of this study, the negotiables are child marriage and sexual slavery, and the non-negotiables are female-led mixed gender prayers and women's marriage to non-Muslims. And the female inheritance one is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's not negotiable, and it's not non-negotiable either, because that's the one where a lot of where clearly even some scholars, well, not it's a fascinating case in that a lot of the scholars haven't caught up yet with the conversation that's happening in the mainstream community. And so I didn't know what to do with it in the dissertation. I called it renegotiable. And then and then when I submitted the book proposal to the press, and they, you know, they sent it off for peer review and everything. And one of the most common comments was, why not just make the female inheritance section is chapter is clearly the topic is clearly negotiable, just count it as a negotiable. And then I struggled with that decision because I was like, but I don't want to mislead my readers into thinking that, yeah, this has definitely changed. And so the difference there is for female inheritance is that the lay Muslim community is seeing that as negotiable, right? People are trying to figure all kinds of ways to give their daughters equal shares of inheritance, even if it is something like applying this portion that is supposed to go to some other, they're finding legal loopholes. And I have Muslim lawyer friends who tell me that the kinds of, when Muslims come to them to talk about inheritance, they say, figure out what, you know, do it Islamically, but figure out what we can do to get my daughters to have equal shares, because I don't know who they're going to marry. I don't know if they're going to marry every legal man, etc. And so I still put it as a negotiable because this is where, and I think it was an important choice for me to do so, this sort of a statement to do so, because now this is me saying it's negotiable according to regular Muslims, right? The child marriage and the sexual slavery stuff, the idea of the negotiable is, and the dissertation is called the gender non-negotiable, right? My assumption when I started the study, and a lot of it was reinforced in the study, in my conclusions as well, in my findings as well, that that Islamic law and Islam and the Islamic tradition, whatever these terms mean, because it turns out we don't know what they mean after all, they can change with time as long as, right? Or they cannot change with time unless, right? And so clearly change is accepted. Like no Muslim person is going to say, nope, you can't, we have to have slaves, we have to enslave people still. We have to have child marriages. We need to allow for child marriages and legalize child marriages still. So clearly the change has happened because pretty much everybody that I talk with, all of my respondents, all of my interlocutors are saying, no, in some cases, they were so confident that Islamic law would absolutely say no to slavery, no to enslaving people, no to allowing a child or forcing a child to marry. And some were shocked and horrified to find out that, oh my God, how could any scholar think this is acceptable, right? And so the idea being that, of course, slavery is wrong. And most of them are like, that's not even a question. Like, objectively, Islam is against these things, right? Islam meant a different thing in that, in those topics, Islam meant different things for when it comes to female prayers and so on. And so change has definitely occurred, because the sacred sources and the interpretations of those sources, the both pre-modern and modern, are telling us a lot of things that, well, not necessarily the modern ones, but the pre-modern sources definitely are, I don't want to say pro-slavery, but they're talking about slavery as if it's just a regular part of life. And yeah, people enslave people, and here's how to free an enslaved person, or here's how to treat an enslaved person, as opposed to slavery is haram, slavery is bad, it's so unethical, we should not be doing it. Same thing with child marriage. I mean, all of the scholars, all of the legal schools unanimously argued and allowed for a child to be forcibly married, right, as long as their guardian, their parent, was approving of it. But I do complicate that in the study a little bit, as I think I begin my chapter on child marriage with the fact that my own grandmother, right, when she was 9, was married to her, I think it was some relative, right? She was married, and I point out that in her case, it was a response to poverty. It was a response to poverty. It was a response to the fact that she didn't have a mother. She became an orphan. And one of the ways that societies, especially those pre-modern societies, but even some today, but those suffering in poverty, they figure, okay, this child doesn't have a parent anymore, but the child does need a guardian. And so my grandmother was then married to this person who was 12. My grandfather was 12 when she was married to him. He had no idea they were getting married. She had no idea they were getting married. And she wasn't allowed to sleep with her husband until she reached puberty. She was taken care of by her mother-in-law. The mother-in-law treated her like a daughter, was apparently very good to her, treated her like a daughter, because the idea was, okay, I need to take care of you, but let me just marry you to my daughter, to my son, right? And so the point being, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of other factors, social factors, societal factors, political factors, that go into these very, very disturbing topics and practices like slavery and like, well, child marriage in particular. But Islam, right? The idea that Islam doesn't allow for a child to be married. You can't marry a child until they have to give consent, because the hadiths say they have to give consent and so on. Except the Islamic tradition, the legal scholars were like, well, the guardian, in a case where she's a virgin, the guardian can give the consent on her behalf, right? So none of my respondents, except I think one or two, one maybe because he was familiar with the tradition, and he was like, the guardian gets to have a lot of have the final say. But the interesting thing, and this is what I really struggled with this, and I debated whether I should go into detail about this and try to figure out, to theorize what is happening here. But all of them also said, but she can divorce as soon as she reaches puberty. And I'm like, what are you doing? But then that's where the question of what is the social context in which this girl is being forcibly married. And I'm saying girl here because so in some way it is gendered, but some scholars did allow boys to be forcibly married as long as their guardians approved. So the change is definitely has occurred, because when we compare what the Islamic sacred sources have to say on child marriage, on and on slavery, on sexual slavery in particular, I mean, my respondents were just hard. They could not even imagine that Islam would ever allow a man to have sex with, or what the language we would use today is to rape somebody that they're not married to, or to have sex with, well, you should never rape anybody, but that you would have sex with somebody you're not legally Islamically married to. And so and sometimes after our conversations, we would have, so after the interview, we would have a conversation. They would ask me, so what does Islam say on this? Or is that, I have a feeling something like, I have a feeling Islamic law says this. And then they would be horrified to find out, well, yeah, you could have sex with somebody that you enslave without marrying them. And so because my respondents insisted, you can't, because Islamic law and Islam requires consent. You have to marry. God says to be chaste, and so chastity there meant something very different to my respondents than it does in Islamic legal tradition. And so that was the idea of the negotiable section. Where are the changes? How are Muslims conceptualizing Islamic law here? And I think one of the most fascinating things that happened in the negotiable section is when I was asking them, what do you think Islamic law has to say on it? What do you believe the Islamic position is on this issue? And what do you believe Islam's position is, or what do you want it to be, etc.? Or do you think it should be whatever it is? And a lot of them asked me, what do you mean by Islamic law? Right. And that was really fascinating because they didn't ask me, what do you mean by Islamic law? When I said, what does what do you think Islam has to say on female-led prayers or marriages or inheritance? Somehow they seemed to think we're both on the same page about what Islamic law meant. But for slavery and for child marriage, there seemed to be sometimes an explicit, but often an implicit understanding that Islamic law has changed. There's an Islamic law from the past that we no longer have to contend with, that we're no longer accountable to God for. And then there's an Islamic law of the present that is definitely rooted in our ethics and not in historical ethics, because our moral compass has changed. So that was a really fascinating section to work on.
And it's not, I mean, the chapter on child marriage and sexual slavery were hard chapters to read, so I can't imagine that they were easy chapters to write. And I think particularly with those chapters, the other component is that what did the Prophet Muhammad himself do, right? What is reflected in the Sunnah or the Hadith traditions about his actions. And you have instances of him having married Aisha at, these debatable ages from 6 to consummated at 9. And it was really interesting to have the interviewees respond to just the age question, like what were the age, some of them saying, oh, she had to be in her 18 or 19 because there's no way she's writing Hadith reports at this time. And so it was really fascinating to see that play out, but also then some were really surprised at the Prophet Muhammad having concubines, and especially Maria the Copt, right? And so it was interesting to also see you lay out these kind of textual traditions, and then to have kind of your interviewees kind of process and negotiate all the things they were negotiating, and often being like horrified and being like, oh, these are not things that would be justified today, because you're not thinking about issues of a child being a virgin or what constitutes puberty or agency or any of these things. They're just on a moral plane. They're like, these are not things that are okay. But then you're like, well, the Hadith traditions or the Sunnah, they say that these things are done historically. So what point can we say that these are not permittable? That was historical. This is not relevant today, right?
That was so fascinating, especially because they're using a lot of these. I mean, my respondents were so informed, right? Like in many ways. I remember reading some of the responses to a friend of mine, and he's like, that's from an undergraduate person, that's from just a regular Muslim person, that they're not a scholar. And I'm like, I know, like they're really, they're very insightful comments that they're making, and they're reasoning, they're trying to make sense of these things. Some of them have thought about these issues. Like, sometimes they would say, oh yeah, I went to my sheikh, my scholar, and I asked him this question, and here's what he said. And for the Maria one, that whether she's a concubine, whether Muhammad married her or not. And in the very interesting study that Aisha Hidayatullah has done, right, where she's like, oh, look at how she's Muhammad's wife here, but she's not his wife here. The evolution of her status. Or when I look at, when we look at books, translations of Arabic books about the Prophet Muhammad's wives, and when she's considered a concubine in some, but a wife in others, that he actually marries her. Really interesting questions there. And my respondents either didn't know her or were like, no, he would never marry an enslaved person. He would never enslave anybody. In fact, he freed slaves. And if the Quran is telling us that you free slaves, then therefore Muhammad himself would never, ever engage in slavery except to free enslaved people. And they gave the example often of Bilal, that Muhammad, or sorry, not Bilal, of Zayd, right? That he freed an enslaved person. And they would also this was really insightful to me. A lot of the times they would attribute something to, not a lot of the times, but occasionally they would attribute something to the Quran that didn't exist in the Quran. And that was really fascinating. They gave me, statements from other Islamic traditions, not the Quran necessarily, where they would say, Allah says that I have made you all free, right? I've created you free. And so if God has created us free, then if we're born free, how can anybody enslave anybody? And some of the folks who knew that were like, the Islamic tradition is wrong. It is absolutely, Islamic scholars are wrong. They had no problem saying that. Like, it's a mistake that we made. We've all made mistakes. All traditions make mistakes, and that's one of ours. That this the or and for, you know, for something like for the marriage and sex with enslaved people or with children, they often cited this very and it's an authentic hadith. It's classified as authentic, that you know, the consent of a child, the consent of a person, the marriage is not valid without the consent of the marrying parties, right? Or that a woman comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, my parents forced me into marriage with this person, and Muhammad is like, okay, you can divorce, like whatever he gave you in mahar, give it back to him, and now you're divorced. And they would cite these hadiths to say, definitely Islam would not be okay with something like child marriage because a child can't consent, or definitely you can't have sex with somebody because you have to consent, and Islam. So all of these, the sources of Islam that they're using, right, and in a way that Islamic legal scholars did not use them, and that was a very fascinating thing to study as well. Like, what are we doing with these sources, the same hadiths that exist in front of us, that we're looking at to make a case for something completely contradictory to what the Islamic legal scholars and other sources used, in very different from the way that they used them. And the Sunnah's discussion, I mean, the child marriage discussion led to very fascinating insights on what exactly the Sunnah means, right? So I asked them, well, what is a Sunnah? Is it, so if they told me that, yeah, the Prophet Muhammad SAW married Aisha when she was 6, and then consummated the marriage when she was 9. Some of them would say, this is something that really bothers me. This has led to a lot of doubts for me. This is spiritually concerning for me. I don't know how we can admire someone who did this. And others would, so they were very honest about and very vulnerable in that moment. And I really appreciated that vulnerability. And other times they would say, nope, I absolutely refuse to believe he did this, because Muhammad is not, he would have done what God told him to do. He would have done what the Quran says. Aisha would have been way too young. This is just, it is not something. So they would say, either we got it wrong, the sources got it wrong, something happened, but Muhammad would not do something like this, right? So we're projecting our own values onto Muhammad in that case, assuming that whatever Muhammad did. So ultimately, it doesn't end up mattering how old she was, but the conversation that leads to, the conversation that issue, that potential issue leads to, we've just such fascinating stuff. And they would define the Sunnah. I mean, one of my favorite people that I interviewed was, you know, the couple, right? So they're this married couple in their 60s or 70s, and they're the husband and wife constantly disagreed with each other, and the wife is the wife is like, well, Sunnah is whatever the Prophet Muhammad did, or that's what the husband says, and the wife is like, no, it's only if he did it and he recommended it to the rest of us. Did he recommend that we marry children? No, he didn't, and therefore that's not the Sunnah. And so really wonderful things that came out of the study with what are regular people thinking, how are they defining the Sunnah? Because if the Sunnah is by definition whatever the Prophet did, then child marriage is Sunnah, and so we should be doing it. And a lot of Muslims do around the world. They do marry very young, because let's do what is Sunnah. So I mean, just really such a fascinating and such a wonderful study. I mean, my favorite thing that I've done so far in my life.
No, I think it's great. And also like being cognizant that this is taking place in an American context, and how socially the American context and like the social norms are informing that, which of course I think starts falling apart in section 2. As we both know. So let's maybe pivot to section 2, even though there's so much still to be said about section 1, but I want to like bring some of this into the conversation. So this one, I was honestly genuinely surprised with the responses. I was not expecting some of, and I even had to go back on some, because in your book, what you've done is you have these charts, and so you have the numbers. I think you've interviewed about 40 people, I think generally was kind of a number that kept coming up. And so you would break up, you ask some questions, and you have these charts that are very clear and obvious that say yes, no, or I agree, or strongly disagree. And so like section 1, some of the statistical information you gave is like making sense, right? I'm like, yeah, this tracks, I'm following along. As I'm reading section 2, I'm like, wait, what is happening? And so section 2 has 2 chapters, and this one deals with Muslim women's interfaith marriage, and then also religious authority, and namely issues around women leading mixed gender congregation prayers, right? So this is kind of apparently the non-negotiables. So tell me a little bit about why such a, anyway, yeah, just tell me what's happening here, because I'm really confused, but in a good way. Like I'm surprised. That's a better word to say.
The female-led prayer chapter is the one that it was if I can have favorites, it's my favorite. Because that's where I think I do some theorizing in a way, because that's where I feel like, okay, now let's talk about this, because there were visceral reactions to female-led prayers, right? People who got angry at me, Shobhana, people who started shouting at me. Like, why are we talking about this? This is so unnecessary. You talk about child marriage. You're right. That's an oppressive thing. We should definitely dismantle that. But who cares about female-led prayers? Why do these women want to lead prayer? Why do they want to be like men? I mean, people got angry, like verbally aggressive. And it was the transcription portion was so hard for the female-led prayer chapter, because this is where like this slavery and the child marriage discussion was hard because of what the historical texts have to say. But the female-led prayer chapter was so painful for me to write. I tried really hard to make sense of this anger, so that when I worried that the readers would be like, okay, Shehnaz, calm down here. But or tell my audience, my interlocutors, calm down, it's not that big a deal. But it is a big deal for them somehow. So that when I submitted it to the press, and in one of the editorial stages, my editor comes back and says, one of my editors comes back and says, something really big is happening here. Like, this reaction, it's not normal, right? Like, because they're not simply saying, oh, I disagree. I think Islam is right. I believe Islamic law wouldn't allow women to lead prayers, and I agree with that choice. I agree with that position. But like, they had very strong reactions to female-led prayers. I mean, again, the shouting was just really hard to bear. The mockery of women was really hard to bear. The assumptions and the laughter. Especially some men would be like, women are this and that, and they just want to compete with men, and why can't they just be grateful for, like, and the occasional, the mockery that came out. And it was so disturbing, honestly, to write this chapter. And I hadn't thought about like working with these reactions and this resistance until one of my editors says, we need to unpack this, because something really deep is happening here. And that's when I decided to get into the idea of the gendered notions of modesty and the sexualizing of the inherent sexualizing of the female body, and all of these other things that became that they were citing. Oh, the woman's body is sexual, and she needs privacy. So why the idea that women's practices of religion are just relegating the woman to the private sphere just kept coming up, right? Or that a woman is inherently something private, and that she would want privacy, and not giving any spaces to the women who don't want privacy when they pray, right? So that was a very difficult chapter. So just wanted to preface that one. But some of the same folks who were very angry about female-led mixed gender prayers weren't as angry about interfaith marriage. I mean, both are non-negotiable in the sense that both the Islamic tradition, right, the text with interfaith marriage, nobody talks about it historically. It's not even talked about. Kishali notes in one of her books, in Sexual Ethics in Islam, that so Ibn Rushd, for example, in Bidayat al-Mujtahid, right, he doesn't even acknowledge this as a topic, which we can interpret as, oh, it wasn't a conversation, they all agreed, like, yeah, you can't do it, right? It's not allowed. We don't have to we don't need to have a conversation on this. But female-led prayers, there is a conversation on it. And the idea there is, there were several scholars who were absolutely accepting of female-led mixed gender prayer, At-Tabari being one of them, Ibn al-Arabi, and a few others who were like, yeah, women can lead mixed gender prayers. And then some of them would have conditions, as long as she's the most qualified one, as long as she's modest or whatever. And others were like, no, if we don't have qualifiers and qualifications for men, then a woman also doesn't need to have those particular qualifications or qualify. Like, we don't need to qualify it for women either. But my interlocutors weren't aware of that. They just assumed that, and a lot of the scholars who are writing about this issue also aren't aware of, or choose not to be aware of it, or maybe honestly are just being dishonest. I don't know. Yasir Qadi, for example, in one of his videos so he kept coming up in my study because people would quote him and say, Yasir Qadi says XYZ, or he's my favorite scholar. And so I then looked to see what he or Nauman Ali Khan or Yasmin Mugahid had to say on some of these issues. And Yasir Qadi has a YouTube video on change and modernity, and I forget what it's titled, but I mentioned it in the book. And he tries really hard to answer this question of what gets to change with time, right? And he's being reasonable, and he's like, look, Islam isn't fixed. It's not static. It does change with time depending on what is essential, right? So there, he and several others, Zaid Shakir does the same thing, where he's like, we can change things as long as we're not changing the essence of Islam. And so then I'm like, oh, well, what does it mean that you're like, we can't allow women to lead mixed gender prayers? Are you saying that patriarchy is so inherent to Islam and it's the essence of Islam and it's the foundation of Islam and you remove it and now suddenly we don't have Islam anymore? But Yasir Qadi uses exactly the example of female-led prayers and same-sex relations and a couple of others. But for the female-led prayers one, so his argument is we can change something as long as it was debated historically. As long as some scholar in the past said this is disagreed with the majority view. I want to talk with him about this one day, like just earnestly. You have to be familiar with the Islamic tradition on female-led mixed gender prayers. Plenty of Muslim male scholars historically that you and I would respect very much and take very seriously, who were very influential, both in their time, but at least after their time, who were completely okay with mixed gender prayers for women. And so that would completely dismantle his argument, because he's saying the reason women can't lead mixed gender prayers because no scholar has ever said they can. Like, that's just objectively false. But again, there was something about the female-led prayer that just really bothered people, and I wanted to really understand what that meant. And then there were other people, I think for some readers might be surprising, some of the older figures, right? In my study, an older male, I think in his 60s, says women can, they can be CEOs, they can lead everything else. Why? They can be presidents. Why can't they be leaders of the mosque? Why can't they be imams? Why can't they just lead a prayer, right? And then others who are like, this was really disturbing, like the sexism and the casual sexism of, oh no, I don't want to be led by a woman. And they would react, they would make a face that suggested something like I would be turned on by her. And some of them explicitly said that women are very, very sexy. And one of them said, for example, several of them said this, but one of them says, if I know a woman is leading, I won't be able to concentrate. If I hear a woman's voice in the mosque, I won't be able to concentrate. And I wanted to say, do you work with women? Can you concentrate on your work when a woman is in the office next to you, in the same office? Or like, so it was very, somehow this idea got normalized that it's okay to think of Muslim women as not as so sexy inherently that they can't lead any prayers. And Islam is not alone in this. I mean, a lot of other religions are having the same debates as well. But yeah, that the non-negotiable section was interestingly much more harder to write because of the casual sexism. And some of the folks who were very, very opposed, some of the women who were very opposed to the prayer issue, I expected would also be opposed to interfaith marriage, because you just said, why are we talking about this? This is so irrelevant, right? These were single women who are like, yeah, I need to understand the logic of the scholars who don't allow women to marry non-Muslims, because I, as a single person, I'm struggling to find a Muslim husband, right? And this is where a pattern started emerging. Oh, so when an issue directly affects us, when an issue, when I'm implicated in the conclusions and in the positions of consensus of these scholars, then I feel like I can disagree with them, and I can say, no, you don't understand my situation, and so I can disagree with you on this. But people for interfaith marriage, the interesting finding there, I think one of the interesting findings there is that every single of the unmarried women said they would marry a non-Muslim person if they were allowed to, or they think that it should be, they said it should be allowed, but that most of them said they wouldn't do it until it was allowed, right? And then by allowed, they meant the men also said similar stuff, like it should be allowed. The men who said it should be allowed said, we can change the position of the consensus of the scholars by having scholars come together, apparently at some point, contemporary scholars coming together, having a debate on this issue, and then concluding, the majority at least, concluding that it's okay for women to marry non-Muslims now. Not exactly sure how they're imagining how this coming together would work, but I imagine a conference or something, or some kind of a write-up, and then scholars like issue a fatwa saying, all right, or the head of the mufti of some, I don't know, say Egypt concludes, or the mufti, somebody in Ikna or Isna says, okay, Muslim women can marry non-Muslims. But one of the interesting things there was that in my earlier question of, do you follow any scholars of Islam? Do you take, do you have any favorite scholars of Islam? Who do you follow, etc.? Who do you listen to? If you have questions, who do you turn to when you have questions about Islam? And every one of them gave me a male person's name, right? Some of them were scholars, some of them were not. Noman Ali Khan or Yasir Qadi, who does have training in both Islamic and non-Islamic Western science, Western traditions. But Yasmin Mujahid was people only gave me Yasmin Mujahid's name, a woman's name, if I explicitly asked for. So are there any women you follow? Do you know any women scholars? And most would say, no, I don't, or I didn't know there are any, or are there any, right? Or then some would say, oh yeah, I like Yasmin Mujahid, right? And so for me, the interesting thing here was that, oh, you imagine, or you want Muslim scholars to come together to change the consensus position on this issue, but what you're imagining these Muslim scholars to be is all men, right? And then some of them also pointed out themselves, but these are women's issues and male scholars have no investment in them, so they probably wouldn't want them changed anyway, and so it's a moot like discussion, and then they would just come back to, can we not talk about interfaith marriage? Very few people said that, and more people said, let's not talk about women leading prayers. But the thing constantly, some of them would comment, well, you just asked really great questions about child marriage and slavery, and those are oppressive, those are terrible, like astaghfirullah, how could we ever have allowed this? And now you're asking about something so irrelevant, which then in my theorizing, like, oh, okay, so it's irrelevant. Well, what does that mean? And irrelevant for whom? And unnecessary or non-essential for whom? And so just lots of interesting stuff there as well.
No, I think you like chapter 6, though, was surprising to read. I think you did such a great job with the data that you had, and how you started theorizing this idea of the problematics of both relevance and urgency of certain matters, right? And I think before we pivot to that, it was interesting, again, I think in chapter 1, in terms of the interfaith marriage, how what happened with Zainab and who Zainab was married to, right? So the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, and then also the Prophet's other daughters, and how they had, were married to men who were not Muslim, because this is the early emergence of Islam as a religious movement. But Zainab's story particularly, I thought, very fascinating. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yes. Oh my God. Zainab's story is so interesting because the Islamic sources are struggling with it. It's so clear they're struggling with it as well. So Zainab is Muhammad's daughter. All of Muhammad's daughters were married to, and in the Sunni tradition, Muhammad has multiple daughters. In the Shia tradition, it's just Fatima, just to acknowledge that. But in the Sunni tradition, so Zainab marries, all of Muhammad's daughters are married to non-Muslims. Makes sense because Islam didn't exist, right? And then when Islam emerges and the Prophet gets his revelations, it is the other side, the non-Muslim side, Muhammad's enemies, who are like, nope, forcing their sons to marry and they're married to cousins. So it is the father-in-law of Muhammad's daughter, the fathers-in-law of Muhammad's daughters who's saying, we need to forcibly divorce these women because we don't want anything to do with Muhammad anymore. Zainab, however, stays married to her husband. She never divorces. And the most I don't even know how to make sense of what happens, but and I wish somebody would do a study. Maybe I should for my next book, because that's my next project. But the ways that her stories are told in the contemporary context, I've listened to some sermons where, they're saying the Imam is saying things like, "Poor Zainab, can you imagine how much patience she must have had to be married to a non-Muslim who was the enemy of her father? She must have had so much patience." Meanwhile, she loved her husband, right? To the point where she's like, at no point, first of all, at no point does Muhammad tell her, okay, you're divorced, right? You need to divorce him. Because even after the revelation of Quranic verse 2:21 in Al-Baqarah, she's not divorcing her husband. And Muhammad isn't telling her to do it. So the interfaith marriage discussion gets very complicated, because even though in this book, in the first book, I'm dealing only with women of the book, people of the book, marriage to people of the book, and that's the only question that I asked my respondents and their opinions on people of the book, not mushriks. Zainab's husband is not just any kind of a mushrik, because we could imagine that, oh, well, in that context, it makes sense that you wouldn't marry a non-Muslim, or the Islamic law would conclude marriages to non-Muslims or to mushriks at least aren't allowed because they were the ultimate enemy of Islam, right? But here's Zainab's husband, who is actively trying to kill her father, right? He fought in the Battle of Badr, which is one of the most significant battles fought in Muslim history, right? He's captured by the Muslims at least 2 times in the sources. And when he's in one of the most fascinating cases, he's captured by the Muslims, and Zainab does this really, really lovely thing and very strategic thing, which is brilliant. She sends over to the Muslims her a necklace that she to ransom her husband, right? So she sends over a necklace to the Muslims, and this necklace was given to her by Khadija, by her mother, who received it as a wedding gift from the Prophet Muhammad. So she sends this necklace over. The Muhammad comes across the necklace as ransom for Abul As, her husband, and he says, I know this necklace. This is my daughter's necklace. My wife gave it to her, and I gave it to my wife. So how about let's give her the necklace back, and also let's give her husband back. He's a good guy after all, right? And so he's freed. And another time, she's holding her husband because he what do you call it, like he's the Muslims are looking for him, right? They want to capture him, they're looking for him. So he goes to her, to Zainab and says, I am basically keep me, I don't know what is the word for this, I'm forgetting my language here, but not hostage, the opposite, like I'm going to protect you from the people who are looking for you, right? And so when she holds her husband there, she's protecting her husband from Muslims. She goes to Muhammad and says, just FYI, my husband is hiding with me, and I want you all to know you can't, because I want you to know you can't capture him. And Muhammad, I imagine he says, say no more. And he goes to the pulpit and he says to the people, from now on, anybody who seeks protection from you, refuge in your house with you, you do not, even if you know they're harming you, even if they're your enemy, you cannot turn them in. And I'm like, he's literally changing laws and creating new policies, right, to protect his daughter and his daughter's interest. And at no point, even if the sources, because the sources are struggling with this, and so we get stuff like, oh, he told her you can't sleep with him, or he separated them from each other, and Zainab stayed with Muhammad for a few months, and the sources disagree on how long that was, months or years or what, or weeks or whatever. And that means that he's practically wanting them divorced. But for me, the significant thing is that he's not saying you're divorced, right? There may be pressure get him to convert to Islam, but at no point are they divorced. So that some of the sources disagree on, did they renew when he did convert to Islam finally, I think it was just a couple of days before she died. In fact, when he did convert to Islam, the sources disagree on whether they renewed their nikah, whether they had an Islamic marriage after, or they didn't. And I'm like, that's a significant thing to disagree on. And then the sources will also say Muhammad forbade Zainab to have sex with her husband, right? And then she could only have sex with him after she returned to him when he converted to Islam. She died, and when she died, she was attacked on her way to Medina. I mean, she didn't migrate to Medina with the rest of the Muslim community. Like, that's how important her marriage to this non-Muslim guy. That's how important this story is, I think. And so she's on her way to Medina right after he's converted. She dies. She's captured she's attacked by some people. When she's found, she's pregnant. And I'm like, wait, if she wasn't allowed to have sex with her husband, then how do we know she was pregnant? Because you would have to have, I mean, it's not, we can't know that, oh, conception happened 2 days ago. Like, that's not. So, and I did the math. I was looking at the different years, looking at different sources to figure out, wait, when is the separation happening? When is she being told? When does he convert, and all of that? And that's going to be discussed in more detail in the second book. But Zainab's case, I think, is an incredibly important one because it challenges everything that I certainly thought about interfaith marriage in Islam. And even today, when people say you can't marry a mushrik, you can marry people of the book, even that is absolutely, you have the Quranic text literally saying you can't do it, and Muhammad's daughter did it, and Muhammad doesn't say anything about it. So lots of wonderful stuff there.
I loved, like, I didn't know about some of these and the story with Zainab. And so I just loved reading it. And you're right, it was just so fascinating to see. So did your people that you interviewed, did they know about the story? They didn't, or did you tell them at some point?
They didn't know. It didn't come up except in one case, somebody said, because the question really was for me, it was about people of the book. I would say, do you believe Muslim men are allowed to marry people of the book or non-Muslims? And they would say, yeah, people of the book only. The couple that I mentioned in the book, the husband and wife, the wife knew. She says, but the version, and I forget what specific version she had, but the version she had was she wasn't allowed to sleep with him, and he converted right away, and the Prophet divorced them, or so, all of these things. And I was like, oh, and at that time I was a student. I hadn't yet read like the fuller story. And I was like, oh, I should probably look into this story if people are like, if Muslims might know this. So she had a completely different version of the story. And then but I think she did ask, or somebody asked me, it came up in some interview, and then somebody asked me about it, and we talked about it later. But no, people did not know. And if they, even now, when I talk to people about it, they have a completely different version. They've been taught a completely different version. And it's not at all something that like it's not in line with the actual sources.
It'd be so fascinating to see how the story has transformed into the contemporary moment and how it's being retold with a different agenda. Because clearly the version of the story that you tell from the historical sources are yeah, it's amazing. And that's a story that I'd rather cling on to than anything else. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So in terms of concluding, your final chapter really kind of goes back to this big question and this question of relevance and urgency. Because what it seems kind of obvious, especially with the last two chapters on interfaith marriage and religious authority, is that people were resisting or responding to you based on this is not a relevant issue for them personally, for what they imagined their community to be, versus the issues in the first section on child marriage or sexual slavery or female inheritance were things that were like, were relevant in other ways and decided or, resolved in some way. So you bring up this question of the politics of this, right? Is change so dependent on the fact that an issue has to matter to you first before people can actually start discussing? And of course, this is this is where patriarchy comes in. This is where Islamic feminism comes in, is that we still think of law having really addressing men first and foremost, that women are secondary to the cause or to the rulings or even the practice of just being a Muslim. Then how is this like possible that things are only relevant to some people, and that relevancy, it gets dictated, and that actually prevents change or prevents kind of an expression of a faith, Islam in this particular moment, to be authentic, like morally authentic or ethically authentic, right? So I love the questions you're raising in the final chapter. So can you walk us through some of this and why you wanted to end off on this note?
Yes, absolutely. Because I think the idea of relevance became relevant because of the comments that people were making, right? Oh, that's not relevant. Why are we talking about this? Or slavery is relevant, and which not, I mean, again, like what does it mean that something is relevant or urgent? This is an urgent issue. This is not an urgent issue. I begin the conclusion chapter with a quote from one of my respondents, and I think about that a lot because it was one of the most fascinating interviews, because here's a respondent who this whole time she had, she was like, nope, slavery is wrong, child marriage is wrong, regardless of what historical texts have said on this. Women should get whatever the Quranic text says on inheritance, they get half of their brothers. And then women shouldn't be leading mixed gender prayers. Women shouldn't be marrying non-Muslims. And then we get to the final question. The final question that I asked all my respondents was, what do you understand to be the criteria for change, right? How do you explain, what do you think Islamic rationales would be for this can change and this can't change? And she was, I mean, it was powerful. She said, I want to say context, and when social norms change, then we change our ideas as well. But she was like, oh my God, what am I saying by saying that? She was like, aren't we so? She was like, Muhammad comes and he's the leader of change. He's not looking around and saying, oh, okay, the non-Muslims believe this, I should too. The non-Muslims are freeing people, and so I should too. The non-Muslims are like, he was the initiator of change. He was a leader of change, and we should always be the leaders of change in every generation as well. And she's like, but she just caught herself, and she was like, but I've been saying no to all of these things that are very much questions of equality, of justice, of love, compassion. And so she was like, I don't know what to think anymore, right? And so it was really beautiful because her reflection, and we sat there, and there were long, beautiful pauses. And she was like, I wonder what my sheikhs have to say on this, or I wonder what my family has to say on this. And that is exactly what I was getting at. That's like, Shobhana, it was so exciting to get this from a respondent, and several others noted this as well, like, oh crap, right? And folks emailed me later to say, I've changed my views on this. Now I don't know what to think anymore. You can still use my interview, my data, but I just want you to know, if we did this interview again, I would probably have different things to say. And I just, like, really beautiful stuff came out of this. But that was exactly what I was getting at, right? That we have definitely the reason that Muslims today say child marriage isn't allowed isn't because it's objectively immoral. It's not because it's objectively unethical and problematic and violent, right? It's because it is largely universally, globally, an unacceptable thing. And it is largely viewed as an immoral thing, right? And so our moral compass shifts in accordance with our social norms. And that's what these, other scholars at Yasir Qadi and these other folks are saying the same thing. You should be changing with time. You can't stay stuck in the 7th century. And then I'm asking in this book, what does that mean? Right? Because when it comes to female-led prayers, many religious traditions and many sects and subsects within religious traditions have allowed women to equal spaces in the church, for example, or in a synagogue, or in places of worship, or in their institutions. Or most other religions are completely fine with something like not most other religions, but many religions. The conversation is happening in these religious traditions, and there's nuances. But why are we so resistant here when it comes to Islam? And suddenly Islam is stuck in the 7th century. Suddenly the change in social norms when it comes to gender, sexuality, feminism, these are suddenly not relevant, even though we just agreed that when things change with time, you change it, right? And so then that led me to, okay, something bigger is happening, and that's the politics. Some kind of a politics is happening here. And so I'm discussing the politics of relevance here, the politics of urgency. What does it mean to say we can change things as long as the society wants the change, right? In Islamic law, we've got concepts like maslaha, darura, the idea that, when there's a necessity, when there's an essential, unnecessary reason to change something, you go ahead and change it. When something isn't serving humanity or the society or community, you go ahead and change it. You can disagree with existing laws within Islam or existing interpretations and practices and doctrines if they're harming people, right? And so then that led me to ask, who's them? Who's the group of people that has to be harmed, right? So when do women count as a community? Are women included in this community, in this, when we say as long as people want the change, as long as people are suffering from the change, right? But then how do we measure suffering, and how do we measure urgency and necessity, right? Who is dictating, who's deciding what these terms mean? And that's where I get into the politics, and I connect it to something like academia, where, and this has been shown repeatedly, especially in Kishali's latest book, but this idea, we don't cite women's work as much as we do men's, or even when women's works are essential to our to what we're to our projects, or we think of women's issues, we think of issues that directly affect women as women's issues, but men's issues are just universal global issues. And so the constant prioritizing of male needs, of male concerns, things that directly affect women in my study, women who want to lead prayers, or women who want to marry non-Muslims, but they can't because there's a whole law against it, and their marriages aren't recognized in nearly all Muslim majority countries if they do marry non-Muslims, right? And so, or if you want to lead a mixed gender prayer, all kinds of horrible things happen, or you're accused of all kinds of things, and meanwhile men can get away with stuff like rape and sexual violence and adultery and all of these things that we agree are just objectively horrible, right? So I'm connecting it to these larger societal issues, social issues that have been taking place in recent years and decades, to ask exactly what is meant by we can change things as long as. And at what point do women become relevant enough for us to want this, to allow for women to do these things that they've been asking us for decades.
Powerful stuff. Amazing stuff. And as you were talking, I was also thinking about just the politics of citation and how beautifully and intentionally you made sure that you cited mostly women scholars, but scholars who are relevant to your field. Sadia Sheikh comes to mind, Kishali, Amina Wadud, Aisha Chowdhury, like it's endless. And so I think even as a testament to the women who are Muslim women who are doing this work, and you not only you being part of that, but you making sure that you're honoring that labor and that work and that community is also such an important political intervention that this book is making. And I'm just, yeah, I'm so pleased. I'm so happy that this book is out in the world. I know we didn't get to talk about all of the things, but I know people will buy the book and read it and digest it and process it for a long time to come. And on a personal note, I know I've been somewhat a part of the journey with you. And so it's just really a beautiful blessing to hold a book in my hand, because we met in Ithaca years ago when you were working on this, and we've had Zoom writing groups and things like that. So it just also feels personal, as a personal investment for me. I'm just so so happy and inspired by the work that you do. So thank you so much for joining me on the New Books in Islamic Studies podcast as a guest this time. I hope you had a good time, and I encourage everybody to pick up the book and read it. So thanks.
That was so much fun. I hope that the folks that I interview have this much fun on this side of being on this side of the screen.
I
Thank you,
hope so.
Shobhana.
You're welcome.